I used to think our unit MACV-SOG was as quiet as it got. We ran deep recon into Laos, Cambodia, the DMZ. We moved in six-man teams, carried suppressed weapons, knew how to vanish and hit hard. People called us shadows, and I believed it. Until the day we were assigned to run a joint op with an Australian SAS patrol. We met them at a forward base outside Da Nang. No salutes, no chatter, just five men in tattered uniforms, faces like stone, gear that looked bare bones by our standards. No extra pouches, no visible radios, no visible rank. One of them glanced at us, nodded once, then turned back to check his canteen. No introduction, no small talk, just a kind of heavy silence, like they'd already started the mission in their minds and we were the ones late to catch up. We moved out at dawn. The jungle was thick, air already soaked in heat. Our SOG team kept formation, eyes scanning, weapons at the ready. Every 30 minutes we paused to check bearings, pass quiet radio signals, confirm position. But the Australians, they didn't say a word, didn't even stop. And then somewhere around the fourth hour of the patrol, we realized they were gone. No footfall, no snapped branch. They had slipped away from us like smoke. We panicked, just a little, thought we'd lost them, thought they'd broken contact. But by the time we reached the rendezvous point, they were already there, already dug in, watching us approach like they'd been waiting for hours. That's when it hit me. We thought we were ghosts. We weren't. They were. We were supposed to be the same. Elite reconnaissance units, hardened by months in the bush, trusted with missions that required complete independence and nerves of steel. On paper, MACV-SOG and the Australian SAS were peers, brothers in arms. We wore different flags, sure, but we were all ghosts in the jungle. That's what I thought, until I watched them move. We had different ways of operating, sure, but I never realized how wide that gap really was until we started the patrol. My team moved with rhythm. We'd built our routine over dozens of missions, set spacing, silent hand signals, scheduled radio check-ins every 30 minutes. Each man carried over 60 pounds of gear comms, claymores, extra mags, maps, morphine, spare batteries. We were lean compared to infantry, but still loaded, still heavy. The Australians? They moved like they'd stepped out of a different war entirely. Their kit was stripped to the bone. Minimal gear, no visible radios, no chatter, no glances backward to check spacing. Just a slow, creeping advance like a single organism, not a squad. They didn't stop when we stopped. They didn't rest when we rested. They just kept moving, quiet, intentional, always ahead, always just out of sight. We'd catch up at a rest halt and find them already crouched, facing outward, weapons up. No one spoke. They didn't even breathe hard. I asked one of them, quietly, if they weren't concerned about falling out of sync without comms. He just looked at me for a moment, then replied, "We rehearse it until we don't need to talk." That stuck with me. SOG relied on technology encrypted radios, signal mirrors, PRC 25 seconds with backup batteries. We trusted that if something went wrong, we could call in extraction or gunships. The SAS didn't rely on anything. Their comms guy didn't even carry a visible handset. When I asked, he just patted a folded message card. "If we don't come back, someone will find this." It wasn't bravado. It was pure, cold practicality. Their entire doctrine was built around not being found, not needing backup, not engaging unless absolutely necessary. We were trained to be fast, to break contact, to hit hard and withdraw clean. They were trained to disappear completely. And over time, it started to wear on us. Not in a bad way, but in a humbling one. We weren't the quietest guys in the jungle, not by a long shot. One of my teammates whispered to me on the second day, "I think they're hunting ghosts and we're the ones leaving tracks." It felt true. Same jungle, same mission. But somewhere along the line, they'd stopped trying to master the terrain and had just become part of it. And we were still visitors, armed, capable, deadly, but visible. And they weren't. The moment everything shifted came on the afternoon of the first full day. The jungle was thick with heat, the kind that makes your uniform cling to your back and your weapon feel twice as heavy. My SOG team had halted briefly to adjust bearings and pass a low-power radio burst back to base standard procedure, something we'd done hundreds of times before. We were good at it. Efficient? silent, professional. But while we crouched there, whispering into our handset, I realized something unsettling. The Australians were gone. Not ahead, not behind, not in the flanks, just gone. At first I assumed they'd moved around us to take point. Maybe they'd found a better route through the brush. Maybe they'd advanced at a different pace. But as we scanned the trees, I couldn't see even the faintest sign of their passing. No disturbed vines, no bent stalks of elephant grass, no shifting shadows. The jungle stood perfectly still. That's a strange feeling, by the way, being surrounded by silence that isn't yours. We whispered among ourselves. A quiet spike of anxiety hit the team. Losing track of a partner patrol in deep enemy territory wasn't just unprofessional, it was dangerous. If contact came, we needed to know exactly where our allies were. Even a single misplaced shot could kill a friendly. And if the Australians had been compromised, well, we would have heard something. Movement, a scuffle, a shot, but there was nothing. We pushed forward, more cautiously now, eyes scanning the ground for any trace. Eventually, after another hour of slow, deliberate movement, we reached the designated observation point, a small rise overlooking a narrow NVA-used trail. And that's where the shock hit us fully. The SAS were already there, already dug in, already camouflaged, already watching the trail through slits in the vegetation. One of them raised a finger to his lips without even turning fully toward us. The gesture was effortless, quiet, disciplined, natural, as if he were reminding children not to wake a sleeping baby. We froze in place, stunned. How had they gotten there ahead of us? How had they moved past without a sound? How had 5 men carrying rifles and packs glided through some of the noisiest terrain in Southeast Asia without even disturbing a leaf? I eased into position beside their patrol leader and whispered, "When did you arrive?" He didn't look at me. He didn't smile. He just murmured, almost bored, "Before you started your radio check." That was the moment, the exact second I realized we'd been doing reconnaissance wrong. Not unsafe, not ineffective, just loud, predictable, reliant on tools instead of instincts. We thought silence meant not talking. They showed us silence meant not existing. And from that moment on, every assumption I'd carried into the jungle felt lighter, like something I could set down and relearn. Because the truth was clear. We weren't studying the SAS. We were being shown what mastery looked like. It'd been trained to believe that radios were lifelines. Without them, you were cut off, vulnerable. In MACV-SOG, our entire mission framework relied on comms, silent burst transmissions every 30 minutes, emergency frequencies, encrypted codes memorized and rehearsed before every op. If a man went down, the first thing we did was key the mic. So I kept watching the Australians, waiting for one of them to break that silence with a quiet murmur into a handset, maybe whisper into a throat mic, check for signal. But it never happened. They didn't speak. They didn't signal. They just moved wordlessly, fluidly, in sync like a school of fish reacting to the same unseen current. At first I assumed they had some high-tech field comms we hadn't seen before. But later, when I asked their comms man, he just tapped his chest pouch. "Message card," he said flatly. "If things go bad, someone will find it. If they don't need to." It wasn't fatalism. It was preparation. They didn't plan to be rescued. They planned to not be found in the first place. Their coordination came from repetition, from shared instinct, from a kind of drilled-in cohesion that was alien to most American units. We trained hard, sure, but we also trusted gear. They trained until they could do the entire mission blind, deaf, and dumb, and still be exactly where they needed to be. At one point, our SOG team leader whispered to my shoulder, "How are they communicating?" I didn't know, but later I figured it out. It was in the way they moved, a shift of weight, a finger along the barrel, a blink held 1 second too long. Their entire system was pre-mission rehearsal and battlefield intuition. They didn't need to speak because every scenario had already been walked through before they stepped into the jungle. They didn't pause to pull out maps or compasses. The patrol leader would just glance at a tree, a rock, a slope of earth, and adjust course by a few degrees. No word spoken, no confirmation needed. The rest of the team followed without hesitation. It was like they were tethered by a thread you couldn't see, each man perfectly aware of the next. And when they stopped, it was instant. No staggered halts. No domino of men catching up. One froze. All froze. It'd never seen anything like it. We moved well. They moved like wind. And all of this without a single radio transmission, not even a whisper. That night, back at our temporary OP, I sat beside their patrol leader and asked, "Aren't you worried? That without comms, if something goes wrong?" He cut me off gently. "If something goes wrong," he said, "we either fix it silently or we were never meant to be here." There was no ego in his voice, no arrogance, just calm certainty. And in that moment I realized they weren't just good at operating without noise. Silence was part of their doctrine, and for the first time, I began to wonder if we'd built our entire way of fighting on a foundation of noise, while they'd built theirs on the absence of it. The next day, we shadowed a suspected NVA supply route. Intel suggested small convoys move through twice a week, usually unguarded, moving ammo, rice, or documents under the canopy's cover. Our mission was observation only. Verify the trail's usage, estimate strength, mark timings, no contact, no gunfire. To us, that meant setting up a temporary OP, watching for 24 hours, then falling back with what we saw. If we were lucky, we'd get eyes on a handful of runners or a bicycle convoy. If we were unlucky, we'd get mortars. The SAS had a different approach. They scouted the area the night before, then melted into position before first light. They didn't just observe. From a distance, they crawled down, so close to the trail I could barely see them in the bush, even though I knew where they were. One man had burrowed under a rotted log, lying perfectly still with only his eyes visible through a layer of wet leaves. Another blended into a bank of mud, motionless for hours. I watched them work and thought, this is beyond recon. This is predation. When the NVA runners finally appeared, a line of 5 men carrying crates and a rusted bicycle, the SAS didn't raise their rifles. They didn't shift. They didn't even blink. They just watched. Let them pass. Memorize their faces. Note the foot patterns, the weight of the cargo, the rhythm of their stride. Then vanish. By the time we regrouped later that night, the SAS already had a full sketch of the enemy movement. Cargo weight estimates, belt buckle details, even markings on the rice sacks, all collected without a sound, without a trigger pull. When it was time to exfil, we began our usual withdrawal. Careful but hurried, trying to erase traces, brushing back branches and smoothing out footprints. But the Australians, they moved like they'd never been there to begin with. They'd walked on roots, crawled over rocks, padded silently through creek beds. Every resting point was cleaned, every pressure mark in the mud covered, even their spit was buried. When we passed back over the trail, I couldn't even find where they'd set up. It was eerie. When I asked one of them why, he answered simply, "If they find your trail, they'll follow it. So we leave none." That was their doctrine in one sentence. We, in SOG, often operated under the assumption that if we moved fast enough and hit hard enough, we could escape clean. Our safety net was speed and violence. Theirs was invisibility, not just visual, but environmental, psychological, even emotional. The more I thought about it, the more I realized something that sat heavy in my gut. They didn't avoid firefights because they were afraid. They avoided them because they didn't need them. And the enemy couldn't fight what it didn't know was there. No one joins MACV-SOG by accident. You don't stumble into it. You're selected, screened, pushed, broken down, rebuilt. You work in teams where failure means death, where your worst day still needs to be good enough. By the time you're deployed, you're not just a soldier, you're a problem solver, a ghost, a survivor. So admitting someone else might be doing your job better? That's hard. It cuts deep. And that's exactly what we felt after 3 days in the bush with the Australian SAS. Not envy, not rivalry, just a creeping, quiet humility, like realizing you've been speaking loudly in a library your whole life and no one told you until now. At first, we thought the differences were just stylistic. They moved slower, packed lighter. They were quieter, more patient. We chalked it up to national doctrine, personality, maybe even arrogance. But by the end of that joint mission, it was impossible to ignore. They were simply operating on a higher plane of discipline. They didn't look tougher, they didn't brag, but they made fewer mistakes. Their presence in the jungle was measured in grams and decibels, not bravado or gear. And while we radioed updates, confirmed grid coordinates, and whispered over maps, they relied on muscle memory and silent trust. It wasn't easy for us to admit. I remember one of our guys, a veteran of 2 tours and dozens of recon insertions, muttering during a rest halt, "We've been loud our whole damn careers." It wasn't self-pity, it was revelation. The Australians weren't showing off. They weren't trying to make us look bad. In fact, they never once corrected us or commented on how we operated. They just moved the way they'd always moved, like they'd become part of the jungle itself. It was us who began to feel exposed, not by their words, but by their example. By the 4th day, we started changing things. We packed lighter, skipped a radio burst, spread out more deliberately. We took cues from how they crouched low when the rain came, how they masked their scent, how they kept even their blinks slow. We began speaking less, watching more. And strangely, the jungle started to feel different. Not less dangerous, just less reactive. We were blending, not just pushing through. That night, I sat with one of their sergeants, older, quiet, eyes like stone. I asked him how long it took them to move like that. He shrugged and said, "Takes a while to stop thinking like a soldier. You've got to think like terrain." I wrote that down later in my notebook, underlined it twice, because in that moment I understood what had been wrong all along. We weren't trying to vanish. We were trying to win. They weren't trying to win. They were trying not to be there at all. And in Recon, that was the ultimate form of success. When we exfiltrated, it was quiet. No fireworks, no extraction under fire, no gunships. Just a silent rendezvous, a quick lift, and 5 Australian silhouettes fading back into the trees before the rotor blades kicked up dust. They didn't wave. They didn't debrief. They didn't need to. But we left. That mission changed. Back at our forward base, the usual post-op chatter was subdued. No one boasted about close calls. No one relived heroic moments. Instead, we unpacked our gear slower than usual, sat a little longer during the after-action brief. There was a weight in the room, not shame, but reflection. Because the real takeaway from that joint patrol wasn't what the SAS did. It was what they didn't do. No wasteful movement, no unnecessary speech, no dependency on gadgets, no ego. We started rethinking everything. Our team cut down gear weight by almost a third. Radios became fallback tools, not lifelines. We began mapping patrol zones with terrain in mind, walking routes along natural cover, not just the shortest paths. One of our guys, a former college wrestler, began practicing stillness drills lying in the bush for hours at a time, unmoving, eyes open, breathing through his nose, training his body to disappear into the jungle. We began rehearsing movement patterns like choreography: when to stop, how to halt silently, how to use visual markers instead of whispers. We learned to move slower, to wait longer, and most importantly, to break the American instinct that action equals success. One of the biggest shifts came during an operation 2 weeks later. We had intel on a small NVA radio relay site tucked along the Laotian border. Our old selves would dropped in at night, pushed fast, confirmed the site, and exfilled under contact. Instead, we tried something else. We moved in low and slow, took extra time setting up OPs, used scent discipline and terrain masking just like the Australians. We sat silent for 48 hours, no comms, no signals. And when the time came to confirm the site, we were so close we could read the serial number off the enemy's field radio. We never fired a shot. And that felt like the cleanest win WED ever had. Word started to spread. Other SOG teams asked how WED pulled it off. We didn't brag. We just told them the truth. "We stopped trying to act like special forces," I said once, and started acting like we weren't there. A few SOG guys began asking to attach themselves to SAS patrols, not to lead, not to command, but to observe, to study, because what WED'd seen wasn't just a different technique. It was a different philosophy, one where survival wasn't earned by dominance, but by absence. And that lesson never left us. Not when the mission changed, not when the war shifted, not even years later, when the jungle was far behind us. Some ghosts teach you how to fight, others teach you how to vanish. Years later, long after the war, I found myself giving a guest lecture at a training course for special reconnaissance. Fresh-faced candidates in press fatigues listened as I spoke about deep penetration missions, exfil protocols, and operating behind enemy lines. At the end, someone asked, "What's the most important lesson you ever learned in Vietnam?" I didn't hesitate. "Silence isn't the absence of sound," I said. It's the absence of presence. I wasn't talking about MACV-SOG. I was talking about the Australians. Those 5 men in faded bush hats and sunburnt faces didn't just move differently, they thought differently. They weren't just trying to succeed, they were trying to disappear. And that shift in mindset changed how I saw everything. The jungle, the mission, even the enemy. We were trained to fight and escape, to strike fast, strike hard, and vanish in the noise of controlled chaos. They were trained to not exist at all. They didn't wait to be hunted. They designed their presence so perfectly that they left no scent, no sound, no trail. No reason for the enemy to look twice. And in a war where detection was often a death sentence, that wasn't just strategy, it was survival elevated to an art form. Even their mistakes were quiet. I remember one op when an SAS point man brushed a branch that snapped loud enough to make me flinch. He didn't curse or freeze. He simply sank lower into the undergrowth, waited. 3 full minutes, then resumed. As if even acknowledging the error would make it real. We, in SOG, were among the best America had to offer. But after watching those Australians, we understood something deeper. Excellence isn't always loud. Sometimes it's invisible. And that had a strange effect on us, not just tactically, but psychologically. We stopped measuring success by kills or body counts. We started measuring it by what we saw, what we avoided, what we learned without being noticed. Even after I rotated out, I carried that mindset into every op, every team I trained. I taught men to move softer, to use their breath like a weapon, to win without being seen, and when they asked where I learned it, I'd just smile and say, from some Australians who stopped being soldiers and became terrain. They weren't superhuman. They weren't invincible. They were just committed, disciplined, focused on mastery over movement, masters of restraint in a war that rewarded aggression. And that's why I still remember them, not for what they did, but for how they made us feel. Like children among phantoms. Like students watching teachers we never knew we needed. Like ghosts trying to learn what it really meant to be unseen. We thought we were the best. Then we saw the ones who didn't need to be seen to win. And we never looked at the jungle the same way again.